Welcome back to Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about James Rachel's The Challenge of Cultural Relativism. So, in ethical theory, the idea of relativism, moral relativism, is the idea that there are no overarching absolute or universal moral truths, that our sense of morality or right or wrong is always dependent or relative to some belief system, right? And there are different versions of this. There's subjective relativism, where it has to do with morality is relative to a person's personal belief system. And then a more kind of sophisticated version of this is cultural relativism, right? And cultural relativism is the idea that our sense of right or wrong basically stems from cultural norms, right? And so sometimes we might think that what someone's doing is wrong, full stop. But really, what we're saying is that what they're doing kind of runs against what all the people around me think is wrong, right? And the kind of cultural norms that have been established over time and whatnot. So this is oftentimes a very attractive view, right? Because what it does is it prevents us from passing judgment on the practices of other cultures, right? So lots of people do different things in different cultures, and there are differences in those kinds of norms. And one culture might want to say that what another culture is doing is wrong. And cultural relativism is the idea that there's no real basis upon which one culture can say that they're better than another, because there's no universal or absolute sense of right or wrong, right? You just have different cultures that are just doing things differently. They have different norms. They have a different sense of right or wrong. It's not better or worse because there's no universal scale by which to evaluate different cultures, right? So this has a certain kind of attractiveness, but what Rachel's does in this article is kind of tease out some consequences of this view, and then kind of he kind of pushes back against cultural relativism, especially towards the end, where he gives some positive reasons for thinking that maybe cultural relativism isn't a very viable option, right? So again, we don't have kind of the idea is with cultural relativism is that we abandon the idea that there are universal or absolute moral principles, right? So one consequence that comes from this is that while we might want to say something like, well, some cultures have, for example, arranged marriages, right? And in the United States, we might say that that's wrong, right? A person should be able to choose who they're going to get married to and all this kind of stuff. But in another culture where there are arranged marriages, they might think that, well, this is just what we do, and the idea of picking your spouse seems a little strange to me, and whatever, right? And you might just think, look, those are just different opinions, right? And that's the way we should treat that. But what about when it comes to certain kinds of acts that we really, really deeply regard as immoral, right? So cases where you have like genocide in a culture, right? A kind of state-sanctioned genocide, like in Nazi Germany, or cannibalism, or slavery, right? If we really subscribe to the idea of cultural relativism, then we seem committed to the idea that what these other cultures are doing, or cultures at different times, right, are doing, is not really immoral. It's just different, right? And that seems like a very unpalatable kind of take there, right? We do want to say that those kinds of, atrocities are morally wrong, right, in a kind of absolute and universal sense, right, and that there's no, culture that's going to come around and show us that genocide is an okay thing, right? That's just, so this is one consequence of cultural relativism that Rachels points out. The second one is that, we could always decide what is right or wrong simply by consulting the standards of our society. So there's no real question, there's no real debate about things. If you want to know if it's all right, to, I don't know, steal office supplies or something like this, right? You just look at the law, right? And based on what people say is right or wrong, and what the standards of that society are, then that just gives you a clear answer, and that's it. And that doesn't seem to really correspond to the way in which we think about ethical standards. They're often not so clear cut, and we're oftentimes not super satisfied with the answers we get from our society. And it would seem like cultural relativism would give us no real recourse to question those things, right? The standards of our society, or to question laws and these kinds of things. The third point, which is also a very interesting one, is that it seems like we would have no room to conceptualize moral progress, right? So if you have culture A, B, and C, and they all have different norms, right? We don't have a universal standard to say that culture A is better than culture B, and culture B is better than culture C, or something like this, right? We can't evaluate entire cultures. They just have different belief systems. Now, if you take one culture and you think about how their belief systems change over time, right? Oftentimes we want to think about that as moral progress, right? A culture kind of gets more technology and gets more knowledge, and they have better social relations, and they progress towards being a more moral society, right? But if there's no, independent evaluation, standard of evaluation to evaluate the society and where it is on kind of a moral progress scale, then it seems like that idea of moral progress is just kind of goes out the window, right? We'd have to say that a society just changes its norms or changes its belief system, but it's just different. It's not better, right? We don't seem to have a way to say that it's better. And so that seems to be another like consequence that we might want not want to have, right? So finally, the kind of other major point that Rachels makes to kind of solidify this position, because he's kind of against relativism, is that there are a number of things that we could call cultural universals, right? And these are certain kind of rules that you see in every society, right? Things like you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't murder, these kinds of things, right? So one kind of bit of evidence here is that you see it in almost every culture, right? Which gives some kind of, what would you say, empirical evidence, right? Observational evidence to the idea that there are something like universal ethical principles. But then the second point is that there's a question about the functionality of societies with respect to these kinds of rules, right? So could a society really function and stay a society if stealing was, sanctioned as being okay? It's not clear what that society would look like, right? You kind of like get rid of private property, and it would just be hard to see what would kind of, how you'd keep that society together and functioning, like how people would have jobs and stuff, and get from place to place, or have a house or anything like this, right? Same thing with like laws against murder or laws against lying, right? So like if you had a culture where lying was always okay, it would be really hard to communicate, right? And it's not clear that that society would really stay for very long, right? So this is another kind of like pragmatic aspect, where you might think that cultural relativism would push against the idea of cultural relativism, right? So anyways, that is the basics here, and that's it for today. Thanks.